I ask that you recognize the gentleman from Pulaski for a motion on House Committee substitute for House Bill 1175.
Gentleman from Pulaski, for what purpose do you rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that House Bill 1175 be ordered, perfected, and printed.
The gentleman from Pulaski has moved for the perfection and printing of House Bill 1175. Gentleman from Pulaski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that House Committee substitute for House Bill 1175 be adopted.
The gentleman has moved for the adoption of the House Committee substitute for House Bill 1175. Gentleman from Pulaski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move the title of House Committee substitute for House Bill 1175 be agreed to.
The gentleman has moved for the adoption of the title. Is there discussion on the title? Seeing none. Lay from Jackson.
May I please inquire of the bill sponsor?
Does the bill sponsor yield?
I do.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
So the first word of this title is reenacting.
Right.
Has something been unenacted?
I think
I'm sorry, I can barely hear you.
Sorry. I think the cleanest way that it's presented there is some of it's deleted and replaced. So if it's deleted and
so
replaced.
something was unenacted, it was deleted by what?
Well, the court doesn't actually enact it, doesn't delete it. But the function of doing the SAPA fix or reinstituting SAPA, structurally we have it, some things are deleted and those portions are just kind of reenacted. So.
Okay. So, but for something to be reenacted, we're having some feedback here. For something to be reenacted, it has to be stopped at some point, right?
You mean like if a Supreme Court strikes it down? Or
like if the Supreme Court strikes it down, exactly. Or a circuit court or, whatever, right?
Yeah,
so where are we at in that process?
The Eighth Circuit said that the 2021 SAPA they ruled, and I think it's incorrect, and I hope to get to this when we discuss it, they ruled that it was a problem for the state to have certain declarations about what was an infringement, right? So they...
Wait. They said what?
They ruled, and I disagree with the ruling, but the Eighth Circuit ruling says that when there are declarations made by the state that certain things are infringement, that was a problem.
That certain things are an infringement. That our law saying that certain things were an infringement. How is that a problem, like constitutionally?
Well, I don't think it's a problem.
I understand you don't. What did the court say?
They said that in 2021, what the Second Amendment Preservation Act did, the state could do. They said no problem there, which I think, most scholars, our Attorney General all agree. The state can withhold Well, even the
of course.
Even the most disfavorable court case, the Second Amendment Preservation Act, agrees with that point. That the state can withhold aid and define jurisdiction.
Okay.
What they found was a problem, which seems odd, is the reason why the state did it, they said was problematic. That the state said, we find these certain federal acts to be unconstitutional because of infringements, No.
Microphone is that. Okay, so the Western District, right?
There's a federal court ruling at first.
Okay.
And Missouri appealed it. That's right.
And then what happened?
And then the Eighth Circuit affirmed the effect of the federal court district.
Oh, okay. So the Attorney General lost at the circuit level and then the federal level? Is that right?
So there were in the federal court system, it's district and then circuit.
Okay. So district and then circuit.
So like in Missouri, you start circuit, then you go appellate, then Supreme Court, and then federal, you go district, then circuit.
Okay, so the attorney, I just want to make sure that everyone is clear on this. So the Attorney General lost the case defending SAPA version 1 from 2021 at the district and then circuit level. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
They ruled that the infringements made it a problem and struck.
They ruled that the infringements made it a problem. Because of what?
Because of what?
Because of what part of the Constitution? What part? What part? Say it for me. Yeah. Come on.
They cited the Supremacy Clause.
The Supremacy Clause. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on the title. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. And the ayes have, you have adopted the title. Gentleman from Pulaski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start with the Supremacy Clause. Let's take a look at what it says in the Constitution. The Supremacy Clause says, the Constitution, the laws and furtherance thereof, and the treaties, right? And it goes on and says, is the supreme law of the land, notwithstanding state law and the provisions of the Constitution. So the Supremacy Clause says is that the top law in the United States of America, which every other law in America must be subservient to, federal law, federal acts, federal regulations, federal code of regulations, federal statutes, treaties of the United States, state statutes, court rulings, all has to yield to the United States Constitution. That's what the Supremacy Clause says. So what does the United States Constitution say? In the First Amendment, it says that your rights of free exercise of religion and freedom of speech cannot be abridged. In the Second Amendment, it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In the Ninth Amendment, it says the enumerated rights in the Bill of Rights is not exhaustive. And the 10th Amendment, which is really what we're about to talk about today, the 10th Amendment says any powers not delegated to the Congress and not prohibited by the states are reserved for the states and the people. So the 10th Amendment says if the Constitution doesn't give it to the federal government, it belongs to the states. The 10th Amendment is in the Constitution, and the Supremacy Clause says the 10th Amendment is the supreme law of the land. That means that there are boundaries on power of the federal government. There are discrete boundaries of power about the state government, which is the Constitution. What the Second Amendment Preservation Act did, and as was pointed out, there was a version in 2021 that listed a series of infringements, right? It said, we find this to be a problem. And, a lot of us thought, well, this has no effect. The real teeth of the bill is that we're saying that Missouri State Police, Missouri Sheriff Deputies, Missouri cops, they are not agents of federal government activities. They're not agents of the ATF. They're not agents of the FBI. They're beholden to Missouri law, Missouri jurisdiction, right? They can't be co-opted. They can't be, and the word that we'll use, that's a good word for the Supremacy Clause that Scalia used, is commandeered. They can't be commandeered by the federal government. And so that was the effect. And each court ruling, I'll point out, including the Eighth Circuit ruling, said it was fine for Missouri to do that. It was fine for Missouri to say that state police are not agents to be commandeered or co-opted by federal agents. What they said was the reasoning when the Missouri found certain things to be infringements was a problem. And that's why they struck down the Second Amendment Preservation Act. So this fix that you had before you is pretty well close to the original Second Amendment Preservation Act, except instead of delineating certain infringements, it says that our state cops don't enforce federal law as agents, as commandeered, as subservients of federal agencies, with some exceptions, right? They can always enforce Missouri state law. 570, 571, every Missouri felony, every Missouri assault, every Missouri gun law, they can enforce. They can work with federal agents if there is a charge, right, that's an ancillary charge to 570, 571 A and B felony, right? With limited exceptions, it says that our law enforcement officers are not conscripted by the federal government. And the case that we talk about all the time, the case even our Attorney General cited, was Prince versus the United States. In Prince, there was a federal law that required sheriffs to do background checks for the purpose of firearms, and Prince was a sheriff in Arizona. The sheriff sued and said there's an impermissible burden put on the federal government that I'm not going to do their bidding. And it went to the United States Supreme Court, and the federal action was struck down. And in that ruling, Justice Scalia said, which is the law of the land right now, which is the interpretation of the Constitution, which we've already established as a supreme law, said that the states retain dual and inviolable sovereignty, that if the federal government can make state police officers do their bidding, right, without any agreement or buy-in or consent to the states, then they are commandeered impermissibly by the federal government. So I'm going to say the Second Amendment Preservation Act is one of my favorite bills we've ever passed out of the legislature. It's one of my favorite bills to present. And the reason why I love it so much is because you're finally having a chance to vote on a bill that restricts government power for once. For once, we're saying the government cannot do something to people. And for once, we're saying that the state of Missouri is not just a subordinate agent to be conscripted by the federal government, that will say no to some things the federal government is trying to make us do. And so often you have bills that have none of that. There's no power restored back to the people. There's no restriction meaningfully on the power of government. There's no standing up for the sovereignty of the state of Missouri that is its own political vision, right? It's something separate from the federal government. And as we've already eloquently established, the powers of the state and federal government are different. The feds do certain things, the states do certain things, right? So finally, you have a bill that asserts the 10th Amendment. Finally, you have a bill that actually affirms what the Supremacy Clause says, which is the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. I hope you vote for it. I do have an amendment, Mr. Speaker. It ends in 04H. It's been distributed. I move for its adoption.
The gentleman from Pulaski has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 1. Gentleman from Pulaski.
So there's just a couple things I think that make this bill a little better. The prohibition on taking ammunition, firearms, those rules, we added against a law-abiding citizen, which is elsewhere defined in a bill as someone who's otherwise not prohibited from having a firearm under state law. So to get after felon in possession, things like that. Should be no issues there. The second thing is there are prohibitions on people who had violated SAPA, had impermissibly enforced federal firearms laws. And I just want to make it clear that if you were in the federal government, you were serving in the armed forces, I just want to make it totally clear, there's no barrier to you coming and working for a state police agency, the Highway Patrol, when you're done with your military service. So we just say that's not construed to penalize anybody for hiring a veteran or somebody in the armed forces. And that's the amendment. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll take any questions on it.
Discussion on House Amendment 1. Seeing none, gentleman from Pulaski, you're recognized to close.
I renew my motion.
The gentleman from Pulaski has renewed his motion for the adoption of House Amendment 1. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. And the ayes clearly have you adopted the amendment. Discussion now on House Committee Substitute for House Bill 1175 as amended. Gentleman from Taney County, for what purpose do you rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To speak on the bill.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Second Amendment Preservation Act was the first bill that I co-sponsored after being elected a state representative. It's an outstanding bill, and I want to read 2 lines on page 2 because I want to stick with the actual bill. It says on line 20 of page 2, if the federal government assumes powers that the people did not grant it in the Constitution of the United States, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. The several states of the United States respect the proper role of the federal government, but reject the proposition that such respect requires unlimited submission. Mr. Speaker, we live in the state of Missouri. There are laws that could be enacted by the federal government that are not appropriate for the state of Missouri, and in fact could take away our Second Amendment rights if we don't assert our authority over the federal government. Mr. Speaker, one more time, for God and country, the Second Amendment shall not be infringed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion. Gentleman from Green, for what purpose do you rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To speak from my microphone, not my own.
Proceed, sir.
To inquire of the bill sponsor, please, sir.
Does the gentleman from Pulaski yield to the gentleman from Green?
I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
So I'm going to inquire of the lady from Jackson here in just a moment, but I wanted to make sure that you and I were on the same page on this. So it's my understanding that the reason why the Supremacy Clause was put into the Constitution, Article 6, Section 2 in the first place, was because of the incapacity of the Articles of Confederation, which was the first form of government in the United States, and how that national government was weak and incapable of fulfilling the functions of a national entity. Do you concur?
I concur that it is both the creation of a union after the Articles of Confederation, and it is a division of powers, is what the Constitution is, a structure of powers, yeah.
But the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, were put in place in 1791 because the recognition was, although the Supremacy Clause dictates that what the national government has laws for, there were many areas of life that the Founding Fathers saw no place for the national government to impose itself upon the states.
Absolutely. If you think about the way the framers of the Constitution imagined it, there were some government powers, and then kind of a sea of rights and freedoms. And then over 200 years, we reversed that, where we have just all government power and a few rights and freedoms that right now we're kind of fighting for, it seems like, every day.
And in point of fact, the Second Amendment did not apply to the state governments until 2012.
I don't think that the Second Amendment was incorporated until Chicago versus McDonald.
2012.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was written only to apply to the national government to restrain the national government.
Right. The idea that it's a regulation it's a way of saying you could regulate people's firearms rights, gun rights. It's saying the federal government can't.
Right.
It's saying the federal government can't go in. It can't go into the states. Again, it can't go into your homes. Right. It's a restriction on federal government power.
And it was originally designed, all of the Bill of Rights was originally designed only to be a restriction on the national government, not the state government. Hence the 9th and 10th Amendments.
Right.
Which reserve all powers not granted to the national government in the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states in the Constitution. Those powers are preserved to the people in the states respectively.
Yes. It wasn't until, the ratification of the 14th Amendment, 1868, no state shall deprive anybody of due process. And then the Second Amendment's incorporation, late 2010s, 2012.
Yeah.
Right. So, that's right. It was always a restriction on federal government power.
So until the makeup of the federalistic pattern, which is different than the national government, which is why I hate saying the federal government because it's not accurate. The federal pattern of the national and the states interacting with one another was modified permanently by the 14th Amendment in 1868. But even the Supreme Court for another 50, 60 years did not begin to incorporate those bills of right amendments to the states.
Because the Supreme Court cannot issue a advisory opinion. You have to wait for a case or controversy.
But there was a case in the 1880s, I want to say 1888, wherein they found that the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states.
You're talking the slaughterhouse cases?
Yes, sir.
You go back in constitutional law. That's pretty cool. Yeah.
So I want to hold true to the constitutional pattern. I'm all about it. And when I see the Second Amendment, it was originally a restriction only on the national government, not on the state governments. And so I just want to make sure you and I understood the Supremacy Clause the same way.
So the way I read the Bill of Rights is, so they created a new government, the American government, this republic. Well, they created this constitutional republic at that point. And they thought about in their immediate memory, the intrusions of tyranny, which were, I spoke out against the king. I had a religion different than the Church of England. The soldiers executed a generalized warrant in my home, and they confiscated my papers and my firearms, right?
Right.
And then I was summarily tried at a political trial, right? And I had no due process. And so if you look at the stream of the Bill of Rights, it's the framers of the Constitution going, the government can't do that. We don't want the government saying, I don't like you, I don't like your religion, I don't like your political viewpoints, I'm going to punish you, I'm going to deprive you of your right to defend yourself, I'm going to disarm you, I'm going to go into your home and violate the sanctity of your home and have a generalized warrant. So the Bill of Rights reads just like that. It reads about the Crown, the British soldiers, who are oppressing citizens who are not political friends of the king.
Yes.
They're written to prevent that from ever happening again.
And they were the offset of restrictions against the national government as opposed to the Supremacy Clause, which was a restriction against the state governments.
Right.
The entire thing is a balancing act.
And at the point that they say, well, does it violate the Supremacy Clause? One reason why, besides the fact that we just said this is the state power, this is the federal power, the states can definitely dictate the jurisdiction of state police 100%. Say what they can and can't do. 100%. No question, any jurisprudence about that. But the other issue is as the representative from Taney was reading the examples, that's almost a restatement of Marlboro versus Madison.
Yeah.
Which if there's a law that contradicts the Constitution, it's null and has no effect. That's what John Marshall said in Marlboro versus Madison. It's a restatement of constitutional law. So I don't have a problem with it.
And create a judicial review all at the same time. We don't have time to get into
review.
We can't get into that.
But it is the current jurisprudence, right? That if you're faced with a law that contradicts the Constitution,
exactly,
that law can't be effective.
Exactly right. Mr. Speaker, may I inquire of the lady from Jackson?
Which lady from Jackson would you like to inquire
The
of?
Engle District.
Does the lady from Jackson yield to the gentleman from Green? And do you have a clear path?
Yes, I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, lady.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
I just have one real quick question, but let me preface it by, yesterday, you and I experienced a little bit of a kumbaya moment in that we both agreed what the Supremacy Clause was. Mm-hmm. It's only when there's a contradiction between national and state law. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it sounds like the Western Court found that to be the case when it came to SAPA.
Well, the courts have made decisions in the past that all of us would agree are egregious.
Oh, yeah. I mean, all these activist judges, right?
Well, Dred Scott jumps to mind.
Well, I'm thinking about the current Supreme Court.
there
Every
are
time
plenty-
they're ruling against your people, right?
There are plenty of examples of courts using their power to insert themselves.
Yeah,
but
well,
let's focus. Wait,
I was
it's my inquiry.
Okay,
Thank you, lady.
okay.
I've waited so long to say that to one of y'all. Thank you so much.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's my inquiry. So
Whatever
let me
makes
just
people powerful.
let me just ask you this: are you aware of any national law that requires state police to enforce national law?
Am I aware of what?
Any? Mr. Speaker, can we get some order on the floor?
Would those on the floor and in the gallery keep their conversations to a whisper or take them to the hall? You may proceed.
Yes, lady, let me restate my question. Are you aware of any national law that requires the state to enforce national law?
Like, what about like a mutual aid bill or martial law?
The mutual aid bill,
Okay.
martial law, but I'm asking, where in the national law do you find that the state of Missouri is required to have the state police enforce national law not found on the books in the state of Missouri? Yeah, I don't know of one either.
Talking about,
Thank you,
like, the Missouri
Thank you, lady. Thank you, lady. Mr. Speaker, I only have two things about this bill that I struggle with at all, and I'm fully in support of this bill. First is, it really ought to be the 10th Amendment that we're talking about, not the second. The second is simply the point that we're looking at, but this is a 10th Amendment issue that the powers are reserved to the states by the Constitution. There can be no conflict with the Constitution if we are indeed following the Constitution. And secondarily, and this is just a minor point, but I said that I would have to say this, the bill calls for a $50,000 minimum fine for those police departments that would violate the rights of individuals in relation to the Second Amendment and Fourth Amendment and such like that. But the larger cities, they spend $50,000 taking a nap. Eventually, I'd like to see this become a percentage of the overall operating budget of the police department that has offended in this effort. That's a fight for another day. But, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much.
Further discussion. Gentleman from Cooper, for what purpose do you rise?
To speak on the bill, if I may.
Proceed.
So, as a huge Second Amendment supporter, nothing does me makes me more proud than to have these bills up on our floor discussing them. A person's ability to defend themselves and to take care of their family is most important in our life. Occasionally, though, Mr. Speaker, we have to call on others. And right now, to your left and my right, in the upper gallery, there are 31 fire officers who are here from the Missouri Fire and Rescue Training Institute Fire Service Leadership Enhancement Program. They're here to become better leaders. They are from all of our districts, from all across the state. So if you all will stand and make them feel welcome before they go visit the governor.
Welcome to the House. Further discussion. Gentleman from St. Louis County, District 162. What purpose do you rise?
District 92. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To inquire the gentleman from Pulaski County.
Does the gentleman yield?
I do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You may proceed.
How you doing, gentlemen?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Doing well. All right. So we've already spoken about Article 6 in the Constitution. It talks about the Supremacy Clause. Now I'm curious, what do you think of the fact that the leading cause of death of children in the United States is firearms? What do you think about that fact?
I think anybody that's killed for any reason is horrible.
I'm sorry, I cannot
I
hear
think
you.
anybody killed for any reason is terrible. I think it's tragic. I don't want anybody to be shot at all in any way. Yeah.
And do you think constitutionally we could do something to address that here in these chambers?
I think there's a lot of stuff we can do to, like I was talking in the floor Monday about how we need to have relationships, with people in our community and how we need to look after kids and families and let people go seek help without stigma, stuff like that.
Right, but when it comes to laws that could reduce the amount of children getting shot and killed by firearms, do you think we can legally do anything in these chambers to reduce the amount of children that are killed by firearms?
I think we make it a law. We have a law against child neglect. We have a law against endangering the welfare of a child. We have laws against recklessly using a firearm, discharging it, harming somebody with a firearm. We're just harming somebody by means of a firearm. Those are against the law right now. Yeah.
And do you think there's anything more we can do?
I think that there's probably not more criminal laws I think that we can impose that'll make us safer, because we have laws against hurting people. I think now our problem isn't a law problem; it's a human heart and culture problem. Why there's violence and why there's people harming themselves. There's a lot going on there. And this bill, it definitely doesn't change Missouri firearms law at all, or how police enforce any Missouri firearms law. There's no change in that. So this definitely wouldn't have a negative impact on the problem that you're talking about.
Okay, and it is a problem for you that the leading cause of death of children are firearms. That is a problem for you. You see that as an issue, and do you want to tackle that?
I definitely want to address people being harmed, people taking their own lives, people being shot, right? We definitely want to address
and the children as well, the leading cause of death being firearms. That part is what I'm talking about.
I don't want any child to be unsafe. I want them to go to school and be safe.
Okay.
I want them to go and play in the playground safe. So the connection that you may be making to this bill is not one, because Missouri firearms laws is unchanged. And because I don't think you make any child safer by taking away freedom from law-abiding citizens.
Didn't we see before that whenever they banned semi-automatic tactical style assault rifles, when we had that assault rifle ban, that we did see a reduction in death by firearms?
Can't draw a correlation between the percentage of assault rifles per capita and, say, for example, suicide deaths. Or specific back test, you have to have a baseline for data, right? So like in the military, every single person in the military has access to probably a pistol, but all of them have access to a semi-automatic rifle, every single one. So the access percentage in the military population to semi-automatic rifles is 100%. It's the criteria for employment. But the rate at which people would commit acts of violence or take their own life, it goes up over time, right? Really the last 20, 30 years. So there's a constant. Every single one of them access a semi-automatic rifle. Every single one of them. But the number of people committing suicide, for example, or death by firearm is increasing.
Yeah, I understand that part. I was just talking about the actual numbers and studies and statistics of when they banned semi-automatic tactical style assault rifles. We saw a drop in the number of dead people in the United States, correct?
No, I guess my point is that
you're saying that you just...
No, there's not a correlation between the
Okay.
presence and also think about, can I just make a point too?
Sure.
Think about how absurd it is to say tactical style is the cause of death. Like if I paint a rifle black, or I put a handguard on it, or I put a pistol grip on it, or I had an extended buttstock, then it's suddenly more lethal, and then somebody has more propensity to use it to shoot another person. Just please think for a moment how incredibly absurd that is, that because there's a different accoutrement on a rifle, it's suddenly going to cause a different amount of deaths.
Well, then why don't we send our military folks into battle without tactical style rifles? Why don't we just give them the wooden rifles?
Gentleman from Taney, state your point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. This is beyond the scope of the bill. This bill has nothing to do with military preparedness.
Discussion on point of order.
I think it's fine.
Gentleman from St. Louis County.
To discuss the point of order.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the bill is about the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is about gun rights. He was talking about guns. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion. The point of order is well taken. Further discussion.
Lady from St. Louis County, for what purpose do you rise?
St. Louis City.
St. Louis City.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To inquire of the gentleman from the Burton District who is walking right there.
Does the gentleman from St. Louis yield to lady from St. Louis City?
I do.
You may proceed.
Gentlemen, I just want to give you an opportunity to just get out a few of your points and just kind of go through it just a little bit.
Yeah, and it's kind of shocking that these point of orders are coming from apparently or supposedly the free speech party.
Well, I mean, that's all I got.
Well,
I have nothing else to say to that.
I think that, you know what, this is my 5th year being in here, and someone can point of order me, and they can try to correct me, and we can have that debate, but just to shut it down, I haven't seen until this year. This has to do with people's lives. The gentleman was okay with me having the debate with him, and we're talking about firearms, and I think that's really a shame.
I mean,
this body earlier today was trying to take away local control. Now we're taking away federal control.
Well, gentlemen, I appreciate
Gentleman
that
from
inquiry.
Texas.
The gentleman is way off topic. We're talking about firearms. Please get back on topic.
Discussion on the point of order, lady from St. Louis City.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand the gentleman's enthusiasm of what he was talking about. I think that the bill still deals with local governments and federal government going together, and how the local governments and the local police officers in those policing areas would deal with the federal government. So I think that specific comment may have been right on topic. However, I would ask you to just allow us to keep germane to the topic so that I can inquire of the gentleman going forward.
Further discussion, gentleman from Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To speak on the point of order.
Proceed, gentlemen.
So this is one of those subject matters that everybody's emotions get wound up on both sides of the aisle, and it's easy to allow that to drag us away from the topic at hand. And I would argue that the subject matter is not guns. The subject matter is the Second Amendment Preservation Act itself. And unless and until we're actually speaking on that subject matter, then it's not germane, irrespective of how we might wish to tie it together emotionally. And I would like to see all of us try to focus on the subject matter at hand. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The point of order is well taken. Further discussion.
Gentleman from Jasper, for what purpose do you rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to speak on the bill.
Proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will tell you that I approached the mic today with no small amount of reluctance. I want to start out by saying that I have the greatest admiration and respect for the bill's sponsor, and I would certainly never argue constitutionality with him because I'm smarter than that. I'm from Southwest Missouri. And being accused of not supporting the Second Amendment is no small issue if you're from Southwest Missouri. And I'm confident that's exactly what's going to happen. It's not true. In fact, it's so untrue that it borders on an outright lie. But that's not going to stop people from making that argument. The Second Amendment, Mr. Speaker, is so uniquely American that it is part of our international identity. Nowhere else in the world or in history have the people given themselves the right to keep and bear arms. It is unique to us in this nation. And in my heart, it's darn near sacred. This piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, is not the Second Amendment. It's a piece of legislation that has Second Amendment incorporated by word only. For years, this body has told the world that we support law enforcement. We back the blue. In fact, we even, a couple of years ago, passed authorization to allow us to have license plates that said that very thing. And then we do this. This bill creates an entirely new category of lawsuit aimed squarely at police officers, at their agencies, at their employers. It grants standing to anyone who believes an individual has taken action that would violate the provisions of this bill. It takes away sovereign immunity. It makes no provisions about who's going to pay for all these lawsuits, whether it's 1 or 100. It makes our officers second guess everything they do with their federal counterparts. It threatens their relationship with their federal counterparts. And it fundamentally vilifies law enforcement by suggesting that we have to tell them that they're supposed to protect people's Second Amendment rights, like they don't know that. It prohibits any officer who previously enforced something that would violate this act. And what that does by effect is any officer coming to us with experience from another state would be unable to perform the law enforcement function in this state because they've all done that. It's federal law. They were doing their duty. They were enforcing the law as it existed at the time. And so none of them could come here during our law enforcement shortage and stand in. And we call this backing the blue? I don't think so. I'm not arguing the constitutionality of this bill. I'm just not willing to stand quietly by and allow our police officers to become sacrificial lambs so that we can make the argument. Our cops are the guardians of the Bill of Rights. They're the first line of defense, and they take that role seriously. Missouri knows, respects, and supports the Second Amendment. I personally, and I think most police officers, don't need to be told how important it is. And I'm under no illusion that remarks here today are going to change the course of this bill. It's likely to pass. But I'll be darned if I will sit here quietly while we cast our police officers under the bus. At the very least, somebody needs to object on their behalf. Constitutionality aside, our cops need our support, and it should be more than us standing up and saying it and then doing something contradictory when it meets our personal needs. A few years ago, this same bill was presented, and I voted in favor of it. I had voted against it the first time. I voted in favor, and I have second-guessed myself ever since. I can't bring myself to do it again. This makes sacrificial lambs of our police officers, and I won't do it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Boone, for what purpose do you rise?
Speak on the bill, Mr. Speaker.
Proceed, sir.
So I appreciate all these constitutional arguments. They're very good. They're very well thought out. But let me tell you in practicality what this bill means for us. You've got a police officer. He's out patrolling. It's 2 a.m. He's by the highway. He sees a car fly by at 90 miles an hour. The car doesn't have headlights on. So he pulls the car over. Officer walks up to the window, looks in the car. There's a driver there. Officer smells alcohol in his breath. The driver is agitated and he's angry. The officer looks in the passenger seat and sees a firearm. The officer says, "Where are you going?" He says, "Well, tell you what, my ex-wife, the witch, had an order of protection against me, so I couldn't be around her, but now it's expired. It just ended a couple days ago, so I'm going to pay her a little visit." Officer says, "Well, could you get out of the car?" Gets the guy out of the car, gives him a portable breath test. It's below the legal limit. Legal limit's 0.08. It's coming in about 0.06, so he can't arrest him for a DWI. Officer says, "Get back in the car," maybe puts a gentleman in his car and runs his background. Officer sees that he had an order of protection because of stalking and harassing his ex-wife. Officer also sees that he has a prior domestic assault misdemeanor for assaulting his ex-wife. Officer goes back to the car, puts the guy in the car. But here's the deal, my friends. It's against federal law to have a firearm if you have a misdemeanor domestic assault, but not state law. You can have a firearm under state law for a misdemeanor domestic assault. So the officer knows this person's been drinking. He can tell he's angry, he's agitated. He was driving without headlights, going 90 miles an hour, and he told the officer he's going to visit his ex-wife. He's going to pay her a little visit. But guess what? He can't do anything because the guy's not violating state law. Now, he's violating federal law. Clearly, there's a firearm there. He's assaulted this woman before. He's had an order of protection against him from this woman, but he can't do anything. And so if the officer picks up the phone and calls someone at a federal agency and says, this guy's violating federal law, guess what? He's in violation of this bill. $50,000 fine. If he calls and tries to warn somebody, says, oh, by the way, this person's coming to your house, well, potentially he's in violation of this bill. That's the practical effects of this bill. It's ridiculous, my friends. And so the officer has to sit by. We're passing all kinds of legislation to protect women and all of this from battery, which we should. But is that right? For the officer to say, have a good day. Now, he's going to write him a ticket for speeding. He's going to write him a ticket for headlights, but he can't do anything else because it's not against the law to possess a firearm for misdemeanor domestic assault. That's what we're looking at. So when you get through all this constitutional verbiage, at the end of the day, that's what you're looking at. You know it's not right. I know it's not right. Vote against this bill. Thank you.
Further discussion, gentleman from Franklin, for what purpose do you rise?
To inquire of the bill sponsor.
Does the gentleman from Pulaski yield to the gentleman from Franklin?
I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
I hearken back when you were at the microphone earlier and the gentleman from Green was at that microphone because in 2021, I was here when the first SAPA was passed, and I was at that microphone inquiring of the bill handler back then, Representative Taylor, and enthusiastically supporting that. So I did a little flashback when you and the gentleman from the Chapel District were discussing. Before I go into my inquiry of you being an attorney, the gentleman from Boone just kind of had a commentary there for a while. Give you a chance to maybe do a little bit of rebuttal on the gentleman from Boone.
That's right. Okay, let me think about that fact pattern. You pull somebody over, they're on their way to go violate an adult order of protection. That's a Missouri crime. The protection's over. They're on the way to do whatever. Okay, so let's think about the fact pattern, what he's saying. I pull somebody over, and they're not committing a Missouri crime, right? So what he's saying is, I think we should add a Missouri crime of possession for a misdemeanor, right? That's what he's saying. But what he's saying is, think about that fact pattern. I pull somebody over, and they're not violating a Missouri law. But I don't like that they have a gun. And I heard people behind me say, yeah, that's part of my problem too. That we're giving, the law should be perspective. It should be, here's what it is.
Yeah, clear and bright lines.
The police should not be able to make up the law as they go. Now, there has been some argument made that this is an anti-law enforcement and that my position is anti-law enforcement. It's not. It's not. I want law enforcement to be resourced, to be supported, to be able to enforce all Missouri laws. But just for a second, I would make that point. Is anybody in this room under the impression that Missouri law enforcement have original jurisdiction in enforcing federal arms laws? Is anybody in this room under the impression that a state prosecutor can file a federal charge? Does anybody think that? I just want to, because I've listened patiently for many months and years about people's positions. Does anybody think that's the law? Does anybody think if you arrest somebody without probable cause under state law that you aren't in violation of a federal law?
Gentlemen, state your point of order.
Not germane to the bill.
Discussion on point of order.
Further discussion? Gentleman from Franklin.
Yes, the gentleman is actually rebutting some earlier conversation, so it's very germane to what we're talking about.
Lady from Jackson.
I don't know. I guess my thoughts are if we're going to narrow the scope so narrowly, when one side of the aisle is speaking, we should probably be consistent when the point of order is the same on the other side.
I'll remind the body to keep their comments germane to the topic. Gentleman from Pulaski.
Somebody without probable cause that you aren't violating a 1983, which is a civil rights rule, right, that police can't violate civil rights. And we've said that those rules that police have for upholding the Constitution aren't anti-law enforcement, but they're us saying what the rules for law enforcement officers are, and that's important that they have those rules. There's not a single Missouri firearms laws that Missouri police cannot enforce under this bill, not a one. And police do not have original jurisdiction or prosecutors to enforce federal firearms laws. The incidences where they do, they are acting as subagents or conscripts, or they are being brought under the umbrella of a federal authority. And what we're saying is we want them to be able to say no, and that's the law. And sometimes when there's an intrusion of government power over the people, we often say, well, as long as if you don't break the law, you don't got to worry about it. And they go, well, this is a penalty. I go, if you don't break the law, you don't worry about it. And that's my point, too. There should be laws for police officers also. And the 10th Amendment's and we ignore it, and we laugh about it, and we laugh about when I say, hey, that's a pre-crime. That person hasn't committed a crime, but you want to take their gun away. And we go, oh, then you're pro-violence, you're anti-law enforcement. No, I'm anti the road you're going down, which is a government that does not have limited powers. And if we do not limit the powers of government, that means we have a government with unlimited powers, and that's a very horrific situation. And sorry to riff here, but you could tell I really do care about this. And the statement that says America is the only country that gave its people the right to bear arms, that was very well stated. But I want to say I'd correct it a little bit, because the right to keep bear arms didn't come from the government. America is the only country where the people refuse to have it let it taken away from them. And so that's what I'm saying. Like, if we need to stand up for boundaries on power. There cannot be unlimited police power. There cannot be unlimited federal government power. We have to say that the Constitution constrains that. That does not mean we are in favor of crime. That does not mean we are against law enforcement. That means we are against his abuses of power, even against our law enforcement officers.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now, 2021, when this original bill was passed, that obviously is 4 years ago. I was here, you were here, but a lot of people in this chamber weren't here. A lot of people maybe listening through their television, weren't here. So I do want to do a little reiteration and going back to what I think is beautiful language in the original SAPA, as well as what's listed in your bill. And the gentleman from Taney kind of mentioned it and talked about a couple of provisions in it, but emphasizing the use of the 9th and the 10th Amendment, especially the 10th Amendment, the gentleman from Green talking about that. And just from a civics lesson purpose, reemphasize how important the 10th Amendment is and why the founders put it in there and why we aren't adopting.
Gentleman from Green, state your point of order.
This bill is about reenacting the portion of the Second Amendment Preservation Act, not the 10th.
Gentleman from Franklin, further discussion.
In reading the bill, there's reference to the duties of the U.S. federal government versus the state sovereignty. It's very germane.
The point of order is not well taken. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So just to speak again in terms of, again, why we aren't even using more in a lot of our legislation, taking that power back to the states from the federal government. The Second Amendment is an example. You mentioned it in your beginning commentary, that it's really a talk about the 10th Amendment, but the Second Amendment is the vehicle. Any more conversation on that you'd like to share?
The Constitution itself is a structure of powers and then a description of protected rights. I think that there are rights that exist before the Constitution. So it says, here's what the Congress can do. Levy taxes, coin money, right? Raise an army and a navy. And then it says everything else is left to the states. That means state criminal law belongs to the states. That means how we commission and give jurisdiction to state prosecutors and police officers belongs to the states. That's my point I was making. It seems, and it's a basic civics thing that I want to reiterate to you, that a state prosecutor cannot say, well, that's a federal firearms law, I'm filing the charge. He can't, there's no subject matter jurisdiction for a state court to hear that. What we're talking about is the federal agents and task force are making the law enforcement officers do something, their will. And sometimes they might go along with it. Like sometimes the reasons people go along with things all kinds of times, for money, for whatever, right? And we're just saying, no, don't do that, because you're eroding something that we want to say is sacred, which is the limitation on the power between the state and federal governments.
A couple more points before I end my inquiry. I know in 2021 the concept or the introduction of the term, and I wasn't as familiar with it, and you mentioned the commandeering. Just talk in a lot more detail about that Prince decision and the idea of commandeering and why that is so central to what this SAPA bill does.
So I think it was the I want to say it was the 90s Federal Firearms Act. I think it was the Brady Act. State sheriffs had to do these background checks for people to purchase firearms. So there was a federal law, and it required a state police, and I say state police, I mean under the jurisdiction of that place, the state of Arizona and the state of Montana. It required them to do something to help enforce that federal law, right? And so what Scalia said is that that federal law had impermissibly commandeered their efforts. It made a federal law and said, you state actor have to do something. That's a lot different than the Constitution saying a state can't do something. We've already talked about things the Constitution says the state can't do. Like the state can't take away your firearms, 14th Amendment, right, McDonald? The state can't say you can't have this certain religion, okay? But the federal government can't make a state do something like that. They can't say the Missouri State Legislature has to pass a certain environmental law. The New York Supreme Court case says that, right? So in this case, the federal law required the state actors to do something, and the Supreme Court said no. You can't make them do something, right? You can't make a law that makes the state police enact something. And so the problem that we see is we don't have any law that says that our state police can't do that. So we're worried about I'm worried about the federal government over time saying, here's a grant, as long as you help us, give us this registry of magazines, 39 magazines, you identify that. Here's some money, here's some joint training and joint task force. All we need you to do is aid us in enforcing these federal firearms laws that are not on the books in Missouri. And I, not State Representative Bill Hardwick, I have a different mentality. I'm imagining I'm not a state representative anymore. I'm just a citizen in Missouri. I, regular citizen, right, would want a law that says you don't do that. You don't take what they give you and then give up what the people have, right? You follow Missouri law. That's the law that I would want if I weren't up here. And I think when you go back and you talk to people around, like in our communities, and I've done talks, people are like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Because they want restrictions on power. They also want representatives in this body that have the guts and courage to say we are going to restrict our own power as government bodies.
I appreciate that, gentlemen. One last thing about the court making their decision. And courts can make decisions. Obviously, that's what they're there for. But when they make that decision, it's not necessarily a final decision. We can obviously have another go at it. It's our responsibility as the General Assembly, as legislators, to find out what was the problem and can we craft different language that meets the muster of what the objections were. And you mentioned it earlier, it seemed to be, from what I remember reading, is more the quote-unquote preamble or some of the other measures in the original SAPA, but the meat of the matter, they never really had an issue with. Can you really just comment about the court's decision and our ability to make sure that we have a response to the little red brick building to the south of us?
So first, conceptually, I don't agree with the court's decision again. I think if Missouri can do something constitutionally, it can state whatever reason. But I think that this addresses exactly, in my opinion, what the Eighth Circuit said. We're not dictating certain laws that are infringements. We're just dictating jurisdiction of state police officers, right? And so they said we can withhold aid from the federal government. And we're just saying altogether, if it's a federal firearms rule, if it's an ammunition registry, if it's a magazine capacity federal regulation, just generally, if it's state firearms law, we don't support or enforce that. So I don't think so the problem about us naming certain infringements and saying we think this law is a problem, that problem is addressed in this version of SAPA.
Very good. Mr. Speaker, this is a big, beautiful Federalist bill. Please support it.
Further discussion. Lady from Howell, for what purpose do you rise?
To inquire of the bill sponsor.
Does the gentleman from Pulaski yield to the lady from Howell?
I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You just talked about being just a regular Missourian and what regular Missourians want.
Yes.
I was that regular Missourian back in 2021.
Yes.
You were here.
Yes.
Were you a freshman?
I was. This is my first session.
So you were not the bill sponsor at that time?
I wasn't. I was a co-sponsor, and I wrote articles in favor of it and did interviews and stuff like that. I was a big fan of it at the time.
Okay. So I remember watching this progress through the House during that session, and I personally made phone calls, multiple phone calls, trying to help get this to the floor. I think the people of Missouri wanted it, and I remember the politics that were being played and that it was leveraged to get a gas tax passed. I remember that whole progression, and I was glad to finally see this get across the finish line, so thank you for your efforts on that. When you first presented this just a few minutes ago, you said that this was your favorite piece of legislation that you have ever presented. Could you repeat why you said that?
Because I feel like most every bill we have grows government power, grows certain interest power, maybe a corporate power, whoever we're trying to have win that day. And it's super rare. It's super rare that we have a bill that actually restricts government power, that says the government can't do something to its citizens, and that fights against the natural tendencies of power structures in government just to grow and grow and grow and consume more, right? And it says, here's something that we're not going to do as a state. And I think that's a great opportunity to actually vote on a bill and it's a fight. It's not easy to pull back the power of government, and it's not without controversy. But we all said we would do it when we ran as candidates. We all said that we would support limited government and the freedom of the people. We all said that we would support the Constitution. So it's just nice that I want to give you the opportunity to vote on something that does that.
I agree. Those are beautiful words. Thank you for repeating those. I don't want the feds to be able to commandeer our cops and use them against us to enforce radical attempts to trample the gun rights protected by our Second Amendment. Do you think it would cause problems if the sheriff departments around the state started doing that? Do you think that the people would kind of rebel, or what do you think would happen if?
I think that, and I don't think it's uniform. I think it's uniform among law enforcement officers, because I've talked to sheriffs and sheriff's deputies and police officers all over the state the last couple of months. And there are some that don't like this bill, but there are some that are very big supporters of this bill.
Right.
And I think that what the people want in those counties is they want us to actually say no to the federal government on something that they hold sacred. And they hold sacred in the state, and in my district, and in the areas around where I live, their rights under the Constitution and the Second Amendment. And I also feel like we compromise on so much up here all the time. Things we said we would do, and things we said we would act like, and things we said we would stand for, we just compromise like crazy in this building. And what I am just making this imploring for us to do is the 10th Amendment's a real thing. We shouldn't compromise on it. The Second Amendment and what we need to do to defend it against this tendency, which is a real tendency of all governments around the world, we shouldn't compromise on it. So, yeah, that's what I think.
Okay. I would submit that this legislation is pro-cop, or could be argued that it's pro-cop, because it protects them from being forced to enforce those federal gun control laws or be fired for saying no or refusing to do so. Would you agree with that?
I think that in the event, yes, I would agree. And I think in the event, let's say a federal task force or federal agent comes and says, you guys are going to do this, I think it might be a helpful tool for that sheriff or that police chief to say, I can't because Missouri law says I can't.
Right.
And we want to give them this law that makes their no be a no that is backed up by Missouri law.
Exactly. Thank you. To speak on the bill.
Proceed.
I just want to say that I'm wholeheartedly in support of this bill, and I hope the body will join me in voting yes on it. Thank you.
Further discussion, lady from Harrison for opposed to right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To speak on the bill.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Harrison County, where I lived in 2021, they passed the resolution of the Second Amendment Preservation Act. And I remember being in DC when I heard about this and how proud I was of our state doing big red things. And you know, the reason they wrote about this in the paper of why they passed the bill is because they wanted to protect our citizens' freedoms. And there's a thing in this bill that I think is really important to note when we talk about our sheriff and our law enforcement. And my uncle, who I love dearly, is a law enforcement officer and has been for the last 15 years. It protects his right too. It protects his right to make sure that he doesn't have to enforce federal gun laws. It also protects him that when he says, no, I'm not going to enforce that federal gun law, he doesn't get fired. And I think that is so entirely important that we see it from that point of view. I love my uncle dearly, and me and him have had multiple conversations about these types of bills and that he supports. And these are the kind of bills that we need to pass in Missouri. You know, we have the Second Amendment, we have the 10th Amendment as well, and that's why we have it in the Bill of Rights and why our founders had them in there. They were leaving a tyrannical government to come and create a better government for us that had freedoms. You can have the right to speech, right to bear arms, the 10th Amendment, to make sure the whole purpose of the Bill of Rights was for the people. It's not protecting the government, it's protecting us. Mr. Speaker, freedom now, freedom forever. I ask the body to vote for this bill. Thank you.
Further discussion. Gentleman from Jackson, for what purpose do you rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To speak in opposition to the bill.
Proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would start out by saying that I believe in the Second Amendment. I support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Missouri. But what I don't believe in, what I don't support, is hanging our law enforcement officers out to dry and creating a situation where crime is on the increase in our communities and our constituents bear the brunt of that. And the reason I say that is because that is exactly what I believe this bill would do in its real effects. I spent the better part of a decade as a public defender in Jackson County defending a lot of these causes of action. And here's a little bit of reality in how things work. In the Kansas City Police Department, there is a group. It is known as the Illegal Firearms Squad. They investigate most of the violent crime in the Kansas City area. It's made up of members of the Kansas City Police Department, half, and the other half are ATF agents, federally sworn. And everybody on that task force is both federal law enforcement officers and Kansas City Police Department officers. And they investigate most of the violent crime in our area. In the course of their investigations, they submit their information to both the federal courts and to our state courts. And the vast majority of the time, when there is a federal charge that comes out of that, the federal charge comes out first, and it is usually one count of unlawful possession of a firearm, which in this bill would be specifically not allowed because it's not ancillary. So in the first part, that task force would not be allowed to exist, and our communities would have to pay $50,000 fine for each member of the task force, and then $50,000 every time they actually did anything to stop crime in our community. And then, as I said, when they actually move forward on those cases, and when they actually get criminals off of the streets in our communities, it's on the basis of the charge that's filed in federal court for unlawful possession of a firearm. There are charges that come later on in the state court, but the thing that gets them off the street and keeps our community safe is what that task force does and the charges that they file in federal court. And to be honest with you, the only thing I see this bill doing is stopping our ability to do that, stopping our ability to actually keep our community safe, and hanging our police departments and our officers out to dry to be on the hook for every time that they tried to do their job, what they put their lives on the line to do every day to keep us safe. Just saying we're not going to back you up. And I think that's the wrong way for us to go. I understand and I appreciate a lot of the important and vaunted constitutional arguments that we have here on this bill. But I would tell you the reason I came here was to do real things and to make things better for my community. And for that reason, I will be voting no on this bill. I would encourage every member of this chamber to vote no. And if I can get 5 members standing, I would ask for a roll call.
You have your 5 members, you'll have your roll call. Further discussion on the bill. Just a minute. Do you want the roll call on the adoption of the sub or on the perfection? On perfection. Thank you very much. Further discussion. Gentleman from Clay, for what purpose do you rise?
To speak against the bill.
Proceed, sir.
I am not here to litigate or really talk about the Second Amendment. When I look at bills that we are when we are studying and discussing, I like to find the source that really will support one side of an issue or another as best and as thoroughly as I can. I talked to our Clay County Sheriff, brilliant man, he has a PhD, and I know that the bill handler has spoken to the fact that he's talked to a lot of sheriffs, and we've had other people mention law enforcement officers that are very much supportive of this. But the Clay County Sheriff and the folks that he's a member of, in terms of the sheriffs around the state, are not supportive of this. I have no idea if it's a majority or a strong minority. I do know that this is a strong issue with people I respect in our local community to make sure we maintain a safe and community for all people. So that source is our sheriff, in my view, who has the greatest amount of understanding of how to maintain a safe society where I live. I can't speak to other places, but I'll be voting no on this because I want to make sure I'm supporting the person who's supporting the safety of our people in Clay County. Thank you.
Further discussion. Lady from Platte, for what purpose do you rise?
To speak on the bill, Mr. Speaker.
Proceed, lady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to very briefly talk about the scenario that the representative from Boone laid out for us earlier. And I want to talk about the role of law enforcement when it comes to enforcing firearms laws. Because when I talk to folks in my community, not only do they want to see our police have a robust response to crime, they want our police to prevent crime. They want our police to do things that makes it so crime doesn't happen. In the scenario that was laid out earlier, what the bill sponsor is suggesting is that the police don't intervene. They see all of the warning signs, all of the red flags. Yet that woman is still at risk, is she not? You let that person go, you know what their intent is, you know what they possess. We could be preventing crime. We could be preventing domestic violence. We could be encouraging our law enforcement officers to work together with their federal counterparts to enforce the laws that keep our communities less safe. Those of us who campaign really hard every 2 years to end up in this building, we talk to our community members, don't we? We knock on their doors, we ask them what they want. Well, I'll tell you what my community members want. They want less gun violence. They want for the #1 killer of children in this state to not be guns. That's what they want. That is a devastating statistic. Devastating. Guns are literally killing our children. And here we are, trying to pass a bill that just, I don't know, it's a balm to people who really love the Second Amendment. You know, some of us on this side of the aisle, believe it or not, own guns. We care deeply about responsible firearm ownership. We care deeply about responsible citizenry, frankly. Some of us grew up with guns. Some of us grew up in the culture. Some of us didn't. But responsibility is the key. Members on my side of the aisle filed several amendments on this bill, none of which were offered. But it's because we wanted to have a conversation. We wanted to have a conversation about the ways in which we can help our law enforcement actually address these issues. But as usual, we don't offer them. They wouldn't have gotten voted down anyway. But we're in the super minority, y'all. You're going to win. But we all deserve a voice in this conversation. Our constituents deserve a voice in this conversation. And my constituents, and I would say most of the constituents of the folks who represent Democratic districts, and I would venture to guess a lot of your constituents too, don't need this, don't care about this, don't want this. Missouri has bigger problems to solve, much bigger problems than just reinforcing that we love the Second Amendment. We can spend our time doing better things. We can spend our time actually solving problems for our constituents. But instead, we're doing this. Instead, we're silencing the super minority who's about to lose this argument anyway. And that's really disappointing. But it's especially disappointing to those in our communities who have suffered due to gun violence, who have lost children. Members of this body have lost family members to gun violence. It is very real to each and every one of us, and I implore you to hear us when we ask you to reject this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion. Gentleman from Green, for what purpose do you rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move the previous question.
The gentleman from Green has moved that the matter under immediate consideration be now put. All those in favor will vote yes. All those opposed, no. Mr. Clerk, please ring the bell and open the board. Has everyone voted? I will remind you there will be a roll call on the perfection vote. Mr. Clerk, please close the board. By your vote of 98 yea, 48 nay, and 0 present, you have moved the previous question. Gentleman from Pulaski, you're recognized to close on your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is important to my constituents. Before I was a state rep, when I was a constituent, it's important to me. It's why I ran for office. And when they say, did you ever do anything to restrict the power of government, to stand up for the Constitution, the rights of the people, you can say you voted for this bill. So I ask everybody to vote for it. Thank you. I close.
The gentleman from Pulaski has renewed his motion for the adoption of House Committee substitute for House Bill 1175 as amended. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. And the ayes clearly have it. You've adopted House Committee substitute. Gentleman from Pulaski. Hold your hand up.
I already my motion.
The gentleman from Pulaski has renewed his motion for the perfection printing of House Committee substitute for House Bill 1175 as amended. This is a roll call. Mr. Clerk, please ring the bell and open the board. Has everyone voted? Has everyone voted? Has everyone voted? Mr. Clerk, please close the board. By your vote of 101 yea, 49 nay, and 0 present, you have perfected and printed House Committee substitute for House Bill 1175 as amended.